Welcome to A-Push. So let's try to tackle the Conquista today. This is not going to be a fun topic, so let's dive into it and see what we can make of this whole mess. We start with the idea of the Black Legend. The Black Legend is the basic idea that the Spanish are the worst, and they wanted to kill as many Native Americans as possible, and that they treated the Native Americans just absolutely horribly. And the Black Legend was pushed by other European groups in order to justify their terrible treatment of Native Americans. So, is the Black Legend true? Kind of, maybe? I don't know. Bartolome de las Casas here would argue that it's true. He was a Spaniard who we'll be talking more about later. Pause and take a look at him. So he would argue that it's true, but your textbook would argue that it's not true because, as your textbook points out, for the Spanish, it was better to enslave Native Americans and work them to death as opposed to killing them outright. So maybe that supports the Black Legend anyway. I don't know. All right, let's talk about Spanish motivations here. All right, so the motivations of the Spanish. The King and Queen of Spain signed a ridiculously lenient and favorable treaty with Columbus because they more or less assumed that he was going to die somewhere out there in the middle of this massive ocean. And so we have something called the Capitulations of Santa Fe, where Columbus got to be governor of any new territory he discovered and got a tenth of any fortune that was discovered. And so Columbus kind of discovered two continents. So does that mean that he's viceroy of two continents? Well, it turns out no, because the Spanish king and queen went against the Capitulations of Santa Fe and eventually passed something called the Quinta Real, or the Royal Fifth. They got rid of that whole Columbus is governor of two continents thing. And instead of Columbus getting a tenth of everything discovered, what they said is that any Spaniard who goes and captures treasure, they can keep all of it and distribute it as they want, but they need to give a fifth of it to the crown. And so the Spanish government did very little of actually financing these exploratory and conquest. So the Spanish government did very little of actually financing these voyages of exploration and conquest, and instead basically subcontracted it out to a bunch of younger noble sons who had very little else to do, who would then go and conquer things and hopefully, from their perspective, become incredibly wealthy. But at the same time, the King and Queen of Spain also became incredibly wealthy, and so lots of wealth and massive devastation on a continental scale. Oh, Columbus, by the way, he eventually was fired from his governorship and arrested for being too cruel to Native Americans, which, yeah, he probably was. And in the end, he fell from grace and died without getting much recognition or fame or glory or any of the things that he really wanted. So good for him. Eventually, that brings us to our first conquistador, a guy named Cortes. He was the younger son of a noble family, didn't get the inheritance, and so set out on an adventure to go and get wealth and fame for himself. Cortes set out with a goal of contacting / potentially conquering, but mostly contacting because he's only bringing about 300 men with him, the Aztec Empire. The governor of Cuba forbade him to go, but he decided to go anyway, and so he was declared an outlaw, and that's going to become important to our story in a minute. Cortes landed on the Yucatan Peninsula, met some Native Americans who could point him towards the Aztecs and also help translate and deal with any cultural misunderstandings that might have happened. As he headed for the Aztec Empire, he made contact with some of the outer subject peoples and realized that they actually weren't too thrilled with the Aztecs, and so recruited some native groups to be allies in his quest to establish contact with / maybe overthrow the Aztec Empire. He then came up with this basic plot, whereas news of his conquest had reached the Aztecs before, and he realized that the Aztecs had this legend of a god named Quetzalcoatl, who was supposed to be this, pale, bearded fellow who was supposed to show up at the end of this millennial cycle and bring this cataclysm to Aztec town. And so Cortes seized upon this legend, and in his quest, he tried to sort of play up his potential divinity. And this allowed him to get access to people and dignitaries within the Aztec kingdom that otherwise he would have been totally excluded and barred from. The other issue is that the powerful king, Moctezuma I, had died, and his less capable son, Moctezuma II, had taken the throne. And so that is also going to contribute to this whole scheme being pulled off successfully. So Cortez goes, sits down with the Aztecs, tries to sort of discuss and negotiate, and then seizes the king and holds him hostage, demanding that the Aztecs bring tribute. So Cortez, now in the center of the Aztec capital, has the king captive, basically displaces him, and demands that the Aztecs bring all the tribute to him as opposed to bringing it to the king. He trots the king out ever so often to just say, yep, still got your king, got to keep giving me stuff. And so he extorts the Aztec people for a time until, in one of these sort of public appearances, Moctezuma is killed. And so, with the death of Moctezuma, all of a sudden Cortez is in a bind because he's in the middle of a hostile city. He no longer has his hostage. All the Aztecs want him dead. And so he tries to sneak out of the city in the dead of night. But his men are discovered, and they barely manage to fight their way out of one of the causeways in what's known as the Sad Night. I guess sad because the Spanish almost died. A lot of Aztecs died in this conflict too, it should be noted. And so Cortez escapes, and fortunately for him, he's able to again fight his way out, partially because of the armor that the Spanish wore, which made them more or less invulnerable to Aztec weapons, although they could still be overwhelmed by a large number of Aztecs. And he vowed to return to the city. So he was able to bring together a coalition of his native allies and also a force that was sent to capture him by the governor of Cuba. And so he unites those groups together into a larger army and returns to the Aztec capital. The other thing that helped Cortez in his whole quest is that during his time in the city, the disease smallpox spread quickly throughout the Aztec city, and Aztec warriors and honestly just normal Aztecs began to grow sick and die. And so with the Aztec capital reeling from both the loss of their king and a pandemic-level disease that had totally devastated the Aztec population, Cortez and his troops were able to come in, along with some native allies, destroy the Aztec Empire, displace the Aztecs on the top of the pyramid, and then the Spaniards basically took over from the Aztecs and continued to rule the Aztec Empire, still demanding tribute from the native tribes that previously gave their tribute to the Aztecs. So they chopped off the top rung of society and replaced them, and then continued to rule as probably worse overlords than the Aztecs were. So that's, in a nutshell, the story of Cortez. Francisco Pizarro was again another younger noble son who didn't have an inheritance, and he'd read about Cortez's adventures in Aztec land and decided to go and see if he could do something similar to the Inca Empire. Pizarro followed Cortez's playbook to a T, but he had some advantages that Cortez didn't have because the Spanish had already made contact with the Inca Empire, and so smallpox was already spreading throughout the empire, and when Pizarro and his troops arrived in South America, the Incas were in the middle of a civil war between the former king, who had died of smallpox, his two sons. So Pizarro shows up, pledges his loyalty to one of the king's two sons. He and that son then go in and capture the other son, seizes control of him, and with the now only king that's left of the Inca Empire captured, he demands that the Incans fill a room full of gold. They fill a room full of gold. Pizarro then kills the king anyway, marries the wife of that killed king, declares himself ruler of the Inca Empire, and you have basically the same thing that happened to the Aztecs now having happened to the Incas. So the Incan Empire, again, still sort of intact, but with Spaniards instead of Inca royalty ruling over them. And then Pizarro himself is assassinated by one of his lieutenants, and Peru falls into chaos. So, whereas the Aztec Empire stayed somewhat intact under Spanish rule, the Inca Empire completely collapsed into civil war and regional fighting. Then you've got Desoto, who had read the playbook of both Cortez and Pizarro and said, hey, I can probably do the same thing, but in North America. And so, Desoto, according to Wikipedia, I'll just give you a second to read that. I feel like this sums up DeSoto's campaign nicely. So he cut a swath of destruction across Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and then down into Alabama and Mississippi, and through into Arkansas. And then eventually his men came out down the Mississippi River through Louisiana. At each stop, DeSoto met the native tribes, seized control of the king, demanded tribute, and, if no tribute was forthcoming, burned the village to the ground. So he extorted money everywhere he went, until eventually the Native Americans got sick of this for some reason. Because, obviously the horrible brutality inflicted upon them by the DeSoto and his men. And they set up an ambush in which DeSoto was shot by a poisoned arrow and he died. So his reign of terror came to an end, although his men were able to escape, and for some reason the Native Americans in the southern part of the United States weren't particularly well disposed to the Spanish. Then there's Coronado, who, unlike the southern United States, which was never effectively settled by the Spanish for some reason, was able to establish a lasting Spanish presence in the southwest of the United States and northern Mexico. Coronado, as you may remember from your Kansas history, was searching for the lost city of gold, El Dorado. And as he traveled throughout the Southwest, every time he'd come up to a new native tribe, he'd ask them about the lost city of gold, or the 7 lost cities of gold. And they'd say, oh yeah, lost cities of gold. They're off that direction, a long way away from me. And then Coronado continued onward with his journey. Somewhere around Kansas, he realized that maybe there weren't lost cities of gold and the Native Americans were trying to get rid of him. So he turned back towards Mexico without having ever found the lost cities of gold. So his voyage was a complete failure, but it was somewhat of a success because although no lost cities of gold, the Native American tribes that he met were less incredibly hostile towards the Spanish, and this helped facilitate, along Coronado's route, the creation of the mission system, a series of missions in order to teach the Native Americans about Christianity and proper living, quote unquote, which gave the Spanish a foothold throughout the southern United States and northern Mexico. And so the legacy of Coronado's expedition was to help establish some of these Spanish missions, which became some of the first European settlements in the southern part of the United States. Here's a cross section of a mission, and we're going to come back to the mission system and exactly how well it worked next time. But for now, just know this established a Spanish foothold and a Spanish presence, and it would eventually be incorporated into the colony of New Spain. So with that, hopefully you're able to understand the reasons why these very powerful Native American civilizations fell to a significantly inferior Spanish force.